Colonel Jack Whitmore, a Medal of Honor recipient, is denied his paid first-class seat at Denver International Airport by gate agent Alyssa Kerr, who mocks his medal as shiny metal. Bound for a fallen comrade's funeral, Jack's quiet resolve hides a deeper pain. As the flight departs without him, he calls a Pentagon contact. Minutes later, the airport halts, planes grounded, black SUVs arrive, and federal agents intervene. The terminal falls silent, tension rising. What unfolds next is a reckoning, not just for one man's honor, but for a nation's forgotten promises. Will justice prevail? If Colonel Whitmore's story stirred you, join us in honoring those who serve. Like, subscribe, and share this video to spread their stories. Comment your thoughts. Let's spark change together. Support our channel to keep respect alive. Stand with veterans. Their sacrifice deserves more than silence. Colonel Jack Whitmore moved through the bustling chaos of Denver International Airport with a measured stride, each step deliberate, as if he were still navigating the treacherous streets of Fallujah. At 54, his face bore the lines of a life spent in service. His silver hair cropped close, his uniform crisp but unassuming. Around his neck hung the Medal of Honor, its sky-blue ribbon adorned with white stars, the gold five-pointed star gleaming faintly under the terminal's harsh fluorescent lights. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a piece of jewelry, a flashy trinket meant to impress. But to Jack, it was no badge of pride. It was a burden, a constant reminder of the cost of survival, of the men who didn't come home, and of the one man who had given everything so Jack could live. The medal felt heavier than its physical weight, as though it carried the ghosts of that day in Iraq, etched into its very metal. He wasn't here to draw attention. Jack never sought the spotlight, not in the years since the war, not during the ceremonies where politicians shook his hand, nor in the quiet moments when strangers thanked him for his service. Today, he was just a man trying to make a flight to Arlington National Cemetery. Tomorrow, at precisely 800 hours, he would stand at the graveside of Sergeant First Class David Rios, his former squad leader, the man who had taken bullets to save him. David's death wasn't sudden, but it was no less devastating. The wounds from that day in 2006 had never fully healed, not the physical ones that left him limping, nor the invisible ones that haunted his mind. PTSD had claimed him in the end, a silent killer, more relentless than any enemy on the battlefield. Jack had spent 18 years trying to honor the second chance David gave him, but no amount of medals or speeches could ease the guilt that gnawed at his heart. He had to be there tomorrow. He owed David that much. At the gate, Jack presented his boarding pass, expecting a routine exchange. Instead, the gate agent, a young woman with a tight smile and tired eyes, glanced at his uniform, her gaze lingering on the medal. Her lips curled into a faint scoff. "Sorry, sir," she said, her tone clipped. "Wearing a shiny necklace doesn't mean you deserve first class." The words hit like a slap, sharp and unexpected. Jack's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. Years of discipline had taught him to keep his emotions in check, even when anger simmered beneath the surface. But inside, her dismissal stung. Not because he cared about the seat, he'd have sat in the cargo hold if it got him to Arlington, but because the medal wasn't just a shiny necklace. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of blood spilled in a dusty alley, of lives lost and others forever altered. To her, it was nothing. To him, it was everything. Jack stepped aside, letting the line of passengers move forward. He could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others indifferent. He pulled out his phone, his fingers steady but his chest tight with a mix of frustration and resolve. He scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in years, one tied to a direct line at the Pentagon, a favor granted long ago for a man who rarely asked for anything. He hesitated for a moment, not out of doubt, but because he knew what this call would unleash. Then he pressed the button. As the line rang, he stood still, a solitary figure amid the terminal's chaos, his calm demeanor belying the storm about to break. 9 minutes later, the airport went quiet. The hum of activity, announcements, footsteps, rolling suitcases faded into an eerie silence. Every plane on the tarmac was grounded, their engines stilled. Passengers pressed against the windows, staring as a convoy of black government SUVs sped across the runway, their lights flashing but sirens off. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Was it a terrorist threat? A bomb scare? A dignitary's arrival? No one knew, but the tension was palpable. At the gate, the agent's face drained of color as she watched the scene unfold, her earlier confidence replaced by confusion and a dawning sense of dread. She glanced at Jack, who hadn't moved, his phone now back in his pocket, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He wasn't angry or smug. He was simply waiting, as he had so many times before, for the world to catch up to the weight of his actions. The memory of Fallujah crashed over him unbidden, as vivid as if it were yesterday. November 2006. The air was choked with dust and the acrid burn of cordite. The patrol had been routine, a sweep through a quiet sector, until the world erupted. 2 IEDs detonated in quick succession, shredding the street and sending shrapnel tearing through flesh. Then came the gunfire from a relentless barrage from 3 directions. Insurgents had planned the ambush with precision, pinning the squad in a narrow alley with no cover. In the first 30 seconds, 3 men went down, their screams piercing the chaos. Jack could still see their faces, Private Larson's wide-eyed shock, Corporal Hayes' grim determination, Specialist Nguyen's quiet courage. He didn't think or remember deciding to act. His body moved before his mind could catch up, driven by instinct and duty. 7 times he ran into that alley, through a hail of bullets. In Agda, the deafening roar of bullets in the deafening roar of mortar shells. Each trip was a gamble with death. The air alive with the whiz of projectiles, the ground trembling beneath his feet. He dragged wounded men to safety, their blood soaking his uniform, their gasps and cries echoing in his ears. On his 6th run, exhaustion and pain caught up to him. He stumbled, pulling while dragging a private to cover, his legs giving out under the weight of his own legs giving out under the weight. They were exposed, easy targets. That's when David Rios stepped into the open. Without hesitation, he unleashed a torrent of suppressive fire from his saw, drawing the enemy's attention. Bullets struck, found him, 2 in the chest, 1 through the thigh, to his chest. But he stayed upright, defiance etched into every line of his body, giving Jack the seconds he needed to complete the pull to safety rescue. They both survived, but barely. Jack was airlifted out, his body riddled with shrapnel wounds, his mind fraying at the edges. David's injuries were worse, far worse than his own. He never walked the same again, his body broken and his spirit battered by years of pain and endless hospital stays. Jack had spent those years trying to make sense of it all. He'd stood on stages, shaken hands with presidents, and spoken words about courage to audiences who could never truly understand. But the Medal of Honor wasn't his triumph. It was David's. It was the squad's. Jack carried it, wore it for them, not for himself, and now, standing as he stood in the terminal, the weight of that day pressed down harder than ever. He wasn't here to prove a point or demand respect. He just wanted to get to Arlington, to say goodbye to the man who had made it all possible. The gate agent's words echoed in his mind. Medals don't buy first class. But they didn't shake him. He'd faced worse than her disdain. He'd faced death itself and walked away, thanks to David. The SUVs came to a stop outside the terminal, and the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Jack's gaze remained steady, his thoughts a turbulent mix of grief, duty, and resolve. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He would be on that plane. Not because of the medal, not because of the call he'd made, but because he had a promise to keep. David Rios had given him a second chance, and Jack would honor it, no matter what it took. Colonel Jack Whitmore stood at Gate 42 of Denver International Airport, his posture rigid yet composed, the kind of bearing that only decades of military discipline could etch into a man. His dress uniform, pressed to perfection, gleamed faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights, the creases sharp enough to cut through the chaos of the terminal. Around him, the familiar hum of travel buzzed, wheels of luggage clattering over tiles, boarding announcements crackling through speakers, and passengers hunched over their phones, oblivious to the world. But Jack wasn't just another traveler. His weathered face, lined with the ghosts of battles fought and comrades lost, carried a quiet resolve. Tucked into the side pocket of his carry-on was a neatly folded itinerary, its edges worn from being handled, a tangible reminder of the purpose that had brought him here. He wasn't heading to Washington, D.C. for a vacation or a conference. This flight, this seat in first class, was about a promise, one he'd made years ago to a fallen soldier whose sacrifice had given Jack the chance to stand here today. The weight of that promise pressed against his chest, heavier than the Medal of Honor resting around his neck. He approached the counter, his steps measured, his heart steady but thrumming with the quiet urgency of his mission. Behind the desk stood Alyssa Kerr, a 29-year-old gate agent whose demeanor was polished to a corporate sheen honed by 3 years of deflecting complaints with a smile and a script. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, a rhythmic clicking that seemed to drown out the world around her. She didn't look up immediately, her focus tethered to the screen, her mind already half checked out from the monotony of her shift. When she finally acknowledged Jack, her eyes flicked briefly to the metal gleaming at his chest, a flash of silver and blue that should have carried weight, should have told a story. But her gaze returned to his face with a practiced neutrality, as if the metal were just another accessory, no different from a tie pin or a watch. "Sir," she said, her voice flat, almost mechanical, "your reservation has been flagged." The words landed like a misfired shot, unexpected and jarring. Jack's brow lifted slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his otherwise calm expression. "Flagged," he repeated, his tone even, seeking clarity rather than confrontation. Alyssa's response was clipped, her eyes barely meeting his. "It looks like you used a military discount, and the system's requiring a fare adjustment before you can board first class." She offered a smile, the kind that was less about warmth and more about signaling the end of the discussion. A barrier erected in a single breath. Jack's chest tightened, not with anger but with a quiet disbelief. He had faced enemy fire, felt the ground shake beneath explosions, carried the weight of decisions that cost lives. Yet this bureaucratic dismissal, stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady as granite, "I paid full fare for this ticket 3 weeks ago. No discount was applied." He reached into his carry-on, his movements deliberate, and produced a receipt, the paper crisp despite its journey. "Here's my confirmation number and proof of payment. First class, full fare, no discount." Alyssa barely glanced at the document, her eyes skimming the screen instead, as if the truth lay in the glow of her monitor rather than the man standing before her. "Sometimes," she said with a shrug, "veterans try to upgrade after check-in, and the system flags it as a courtesy request. I'm not saying you did anything wrong, but that's what the system says." Her tone was rehearsed, a shield of policy that deflected accountability. "I can assign you a coach seat, or you can pay the balance now to board first class." Jack's jaw tightened, but his composure held. The insult wasn't in the words alone, it was in the way she reduced him to a problem, a glitch in her system. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm, each word chosen with the precision of a man who knew the cost of every syllable. "There is no balance," he said. "I paid in full. This isn't about a seat. It's about getting to D.C. to honor a soldier's widow, a woman who deserves to know her husband's sacrifice hasn't been forgotten." Alyssa's expression didn't shift. She leaned back on one foot, her arms crossed, and muttered just loud enough for the words to slice through the air. "Some people think a shiny medal gets them extra privileges." The comment was a dagger, cloaked in casual disdain, and it struck deeper than any wound Jack had ever sustained in combat. His spine straightened, not out of pride, but from a reflex of restraint, a hard-won discipline that kept him from reacting with the anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. He could still hear the explosions, feel the weight of his friend's lifeless body in his arms, see the faces of those who never made it home. That medal wasn't a trophy, it was a reminder of the koan, a symbol of a debt he could never repay. And now it was being dismissed as a trinket, a prop for entitlement. He placed the receipt on the counter with a precision that mirrored his military training, his fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "This isn't about privilege," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of a man who had stared down death and come out the other side. "It's about a promise A soldier saved my life, and I owe it to him to be there for his family. This flight is the only way I can make that happen." Alyssa clicked her mouse, her face unmoved, as if his words were just another passenger complaint to be brushed aside. "Sir, I'm just doing my job," she said, her tone final, her focus already shifting to the next task. Around them, the gate area pulsed with life. Passengers nearby began to notice the tension, their heads turning like radar, picking up a signal. A man in a business suit nudged his wife, whispering something that made her glance at Jack. A teenager in the corner, half hidden behind a row of seats, raised a smartphone, discreetly filming the exchange. They didn't know Jack's story, didn't know the weight of the metal or the mission that drove him, but they sensed something was wrong, a quiet injustice unfolding in the mundane chaos of an airport gate. A TSA officer, drawn by the subtle shift in the crowd's attention, approached but hesitated when he caught sight of the Medal of Honor glinting under the terminal lights. It was a symbol that demanded respect, a rare honor that carried a story few could fully comprehend. Yet Alyssa remained unmoved, her resolve as rigid as the policies she hid behind. "You can take a coach seat, or you can wait for a different flight," she repeated, her voice a monotone script. "Those are your options." Jack's gaze drifted past her to the gate, where first-class passengers were now boarding, their footsteps muffled by the jet bridge. The door to Flight 2178 stood open, a narrow window of opportunity that was closing with every second. He felt the weight of time pressing against him, not just the ticking clock of the flight schedule, but the years of guilt, gratitude, and duty that had brought him to this moment. "I'm asking you to review the reservation properly," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet plea, a final attempt to bridge the gap between his truth and her indifference. But Alyssa didn't budge. Her fingers tapped a key, and with a soft hiss, the jet bridge door closed. The sound was a dull thud, echoing across the gate area like a gavel striking a verdict. Outside, Flight 2178 began to push back from the terminal, its wheels rolling, engines spooling up with a low whine. Jack stood motionless, the receipt still on the counter, his mission slipping away with the plane. The weight of the metal around his neck felt heavier than ever, not because of its metal, but because of the promise it represented, a promise he might not be able to keep. Jack Whitmore stood motionless, a solitary figure framed against the expansive terminal window, his silhouette etched sharply against the gray Denver sky. His arms hung heavy at his sides, not from fatigue, but from the weight of a moment that felt like a betrayal. Outside, the aircraft that held his seat, 2A, first class, paid in full, taxied away, its engines humming a low, indifferent farewell. The plane was bound for Washington, D.C., for a funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, a sacred place where time did not bend for anyone, not even for a man like Jack, who had earned the nation's highest honor. The ticking clock of tomorrow's ceremony loomed in his mind, relentless, unyielding. He could almost hear it, each second slipping away, carrying with it his chance to stand one last time for Sergeant Michael Rios, the man who had thrown himself into a hail of bullets to drag Jack to safety all those years ago in a dusty, blood-soaked corner of Fallujah. The chill in the terminal didn't come from the air conditioning humming overhead. It was something deeper, colder, a quiet ache that settled into Jack's chest, a familiar pang he hadn't felt since the war. It wasn't the raw, adrenaline-soaked weight of combat where survival demanded action. This was different. This was the slow, grinding helplessness of being dismissed, of having his service reduced to a bureaucratic inconvenience. His fingers tightened briefly around the Medal of Honor resting against his chest, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of what he'd endured to earn it. The medal gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, unnoticed by most. But to Jack, it was a tether to a life of sacrifice now casually brushed aside by a gate agent's indifference. Across the gate area, Alyssa, the young woman behind the counter, barely looked up from her computer screen. Her fingers moved swiftly, already processing the next boarding group, her mind on the rhythm of her job, check-ins, scans, announcements. She had no idea who Jack was, no inkling of the history etched into the lines of his weathered face or the significance of the ribbon around his neck. To her, he was just another passenger, one whose military status had triggered a system error, a red flag in the airline's overzealous security protocols. She'd followed procedure, nothing more. And in her mind, the matter was closed. But for Jack, it was anything but. The aircraft was gone, and with it, his only timely way to honor the man who'd saved his life. The unfairness of it gnawed at him, not as anger, but as a quiet, persistent sorrow, like a wound that never quite healed. Around him, the terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travel, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, business travelers tapping impatiently at their phones, flight attendants exchanging clipped words. But a few passengers had noticed the exchange at the counter, the way Alyssa's voice had remained flat and unyielding, the way Jack's shoulders had stiffened as he stepped back from the desk. They saw the metal, the rigid set of his palm, the way he turned to the window as if searching for something the plane was taking away. Their silence wasn't indifference. It was the uneasy quiet of witnesses to an injustice they didn't know how to name. For them, the moment lingered, heavy with the sense that something sacred had been quietly pushed aside. Jack's mind churned, replaying the conversation with Alyssa. "Your military status flagged the seat," she'd said, her tone clipped, her eyes barely meeting his. "I can't override the system. You'll need to rebook." No apology, no hesitation, just the cold efficiency of someone following a script. He'd offered his documents, decades of service neatly folded into a few sheets of paper, but she hadn't even glanced at them. The dismissal stung more than the loss of the seat. It was the erasure of everything he'd carried, everything he'd survived. For a moment, he was back in Iraq, standing over a row of flag-draped caskets, the air thick with grief and the weight of promises unkept. Sergeant Rios had been there then, his steady hand on Jack's shoulder, his voice cutting through the haze. "We keep going, Whitmore. For them." Now Jack was failing him, grounded by a system that didn't care. But Jack Whitmore wasn't a man who accepted dead ends. He'd survived ambushes, navigated minefields, and outlasted nights when death seemed certain. This wasn't over. He stepped back from the window, his boots heavy on the polished terminal floor, and reached into his laptop bag. His fingers closed around his phone, the weight of it grounding him. He scrolled through his contacts, hesitating for a heartbeat over a name he hadn't called in over 2 years. General Marissa Delaney, Pentagon Chief of Staff, a woman who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with him through the worst days of their lives. She'd pinned the Bronze Star on his chest in a dusty tent in Iraq, her eyes fierce with pride. She'd been there when they buried 6 soldiers in a single week, her voice steady as she read their names into the desert wind. If anyone could cut through this, it was her. He tapped the call button, his heart thudding with a mix of resolve and reluctance. He hated asking for help, hated the vulnerability of it, but this wasn't about him. It was about Rios. The phone rang twice before her voice came through, crisp and commanding, unchanged by the years. Whitmore. Just his name, but it carried the weight of their shared history. Jack exhaled, steadying himself. "Yes, ma'am. I hate to call like this, but I've just been denied boarding on a paid first-class ticket. Gate agent said my military status flagged the seat. Wouldn't even look at my documents. I'm going to miss Sergeant Rios' funeral at Arlington." There was a pause on the other end, not hesitation, but the deliberate silence of someone calculating their next move. Jack could picture her, standing in some Pentagon office, her sharp eyes narrowing as she processed his words. "Are you at the airport now?" she asked, her voice clipped but warm with concern. "Denver, Gate 42, Flight 2178 to Washington. It just left without me." Her tone shifted, cold and unyielding now, the voice of a commander who'd faced down chaos and won. "You're telling me a Medal of Honor recipient was denied a paid seat to attend a funeral at Arlington?" Jack swallowed, the weight of her words sinking in. "Yes, ma'am." "Understood. Stay where you are. This is about to be resolved." She didn't say goodbye. She never did. The line went dead and Jack slid the phone back into his bag, his heart still racing but steadied by the certainty in her voice. He turned back to the gate area, his eyes scanning the crowd. A few passengers glanced up, their gazes lingering on the metal around his neck. It wasn't just a decoration anymore. It was a beacon, a silent declaration that something had gone terribly wrong. The air felt charged, as if the terminal itself sensed a shift, a reckoning brewing. 9 minutes later, the hum of the airport stopped. The boarding calls, the background announcements, the clatter of luggage, all of it fell silent. Every terminal screen flickered, the usual flight schedules freezing before shifting to a single stark message. All aircraft movement temporarily suspended by federal order. Remain in terminal until further notice. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman nearby clutched her boarding pass, her knuckles whitening. Children stopped fidgeting, sensing the tension in their parents' faces. Flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances, their usual poise faltering. Alyssa looked up from her computer, her brow furrowing, confusion replacing her earlier indifference. A TSA agent hurried toward the counter, his steps quick and purposeful, followed by two men in crisp black suits. Their federal credentials gleamed under the terminal lights, and one wore an earpiece, his expression unreadable. He tapped the radio on his shoulder, nodded toward the tarmac, and stepped aside without a word. The authority in his silence was unmistakable. Outside, the glass windows revealed a surreal sight, a convoy of sleek black SUVs speeding across the tarmac, their emergency lights flickering in precise, controlled bursts. There was no case, no blaring sirens, just the quiet, undeniable presence of power in motion. Jack's gaze followed the vehicles, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and gratitude. Somewhere in a Pentagon operations room, he knew General Delaney was at work. He could imagine her standing before a panel of FAA officials, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, her authority bending the system to right this wrong. For Jack, it wasn't just about getting to Arlington anymore. It was about the weight of honor, the debt he owed to Rios, and the unspoken promise that no one who'd served would be left behind, not by a bureaucracy, not by indifference, not by anything. As the terminal held its breath, Jack stood a little taller, the metal around his neck gleaming faintly, a quiet testament to a fight that wasn't over yet. The Denver terminal buzzed with the restless energy of travelers, their voices blending into a low hum that filled the air like static. But when General Delaney spoke, her words cut through the noise like a blade, silencing every distraction. Her voice was calm, deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of years spent commanding respect in rooms far more intimidating than this one. "This isn't about following protocol," she said, her tone steady but unyielding, her eyes scanning the faces of the senior staff around her. "It's about precedent. If we allow a Medal of Honor recipient, a man traveling to bury his fallen brother, to be denied his seat over some bureaucratic oversight, we're failing more than just him. We're failing the principles we claim to defend." Her gaze was piercing, locking onto each person in the room, daring them to challenge her. There was no hesitation, no room for debate. The order was given, and the command center screen went dark, the decision final. At Gate 42, the terminal's usual chaos, rolling suitcases, hurried announcements, the clatter of coffee cups, had dissolved into a stunned silence. Passengers stood still, their phones half-gape raised, capturing a moment that felt too significant to fully grasp. It was cinematic, almost unreal, as if the scene had been scripted for a film. At its center stood Colonel Jack Whitmore, his posture rigid, his uniform immaculate despite the long hours of travel. His eyes, though, were elsewhere, fixed on some distant point only he could see. Jack hadn't sought this attention. He hadn't asked for the growing crowd, the whispers, or the weight of their stares. But sometimes dignity doesn't come from demanding recognition. Sometimes it's in the quiet resolve of standing your ground, unwavering, until someone with the power to act remembers what honor looks like. Today, General Delaney had remembered, and her decision rippled through the terminal like a shockwave. In less than 10 minutes, Gate 42 had transformed from a mundane checkpoint into a stage for something extraordinary. Passengers clustered together, their voices low as they exchanged theories about what was happening. Some thought it was a security drill, a test of protocols. Others whispered of a national emergency, though the absence of alarms or evacuations only deepened the mystery. A quiet tension hung in the air, a sense that something profound was unfolding, something bigger than any one person could fully understand. Then the men in black arrived. Two federal agents, their Department of Homeland Security badges catching the harsh fluorescent light, moved through the crowd with a quiet authority that parted the sea of travelers. The older agent, a woman with gray streaks woven into her tightly pulled bun, caressed herself with a calm that spoke of years spent navigating crises. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, held a depth of experience she didn't need to articulate. She approached the gate counter, where Alyssa Kerr was still typing, her focus so narrow she hadn't yet sensed the storm gathering around her. "Miss Alyssa Kerr?" the agent asked, her voice even but firm, leaving no room for avoidance. Alyssa's head snapped up, her brow creasing with confusion, her fingers freezing above the keyboard. "Yes," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty, as if she could feel the ground shifting beneath her. "Agent Rebecca Martinez, DHS," the woman said, her badge flashing briefly in her hand. "We need to speak with you immediately regarding your interaction with Colonel Jack Whitmore." Alyssa's carefully polished corporate facade cracked. Her eyes darted toward the empty office where her supervisor usually sat, a silent plea for rescue that went unanswered. She'd followed protocol, hadn't she? She'd done her job, enforced the rules as she'd been trained. But the weight of the agent's presence, the growing crowd, and the murmurs rippling through the terminal told her this was no ordinary mistake. The second agent, younger with a padlet already glowing in his hands, tapped the screen with precision. "We have a copy of your gate activity log and surveillance footage," he said, his voice clipped, professional. "Your statement doesn't align with the data." The words hit like a verdict, and Alyssa's face drained of color. Her mind raced, replaying the interaction with Jack, searching for where she'd gone wrong. She'd been so sure she was in the right, but now, under the agent's steady gazes, doubt began to creep in. The crowd was growing now, passengers pulling out their phones to record the unfolding drama. One man, his voice low but carrying, muttered, "That's the lady who kicked out the veteran." A woman nearby, clutching a coffee cup, whispered, "That's the guy with the Medal of Honor." The words spread like wildfire, and within minutes, they'd crystallize into a hashtag that would ignite across social media. Colonel Whitmore stood a few feet away, watching the scene with a quiet solemnity. There was no trace of triumph in his eyes, no hint of anger. If anything, his expression carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many systems fail, too many promises broken. He wasn't here to gloat or to seek vengeance. He was here for a purpose far greater than himself, to honor a man who'd saved his life, a brother in arms now gone. And yet, here he stood, caught in a spectacle he hadn't chosen, his silence louder than any protest could have been. The airline manager arrived at last, his face flushed, sweat beading on his forehead as he clutched his phone like a lifeline. He moved with the frantic energy of someone who just received a call from corporate headquarters, the kind that began with a furious, "What the hell happened?" He spotted Jack and hurried over, his voice breathless with forced sincerity. "Colonel Whitmore, sir, please accept our sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding." Jack turned to face him, his movements slow, deliberate, his eyes locking onto the manager's with an intensity that made the man flinch. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," he said, his voice soft but cutting, each word laced with a quiet conviction that carried more weight than any shout. "It was a judgment." The manager fumbled, his hands gesturing vaguely as if searching for the right words to diffuse the situation. "Of course, yes, we're deeply sorry for the treatment you received. We're reinstating your original reservation, and we'd like to offer you complimentary first-class service for life." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of approval and disbelief. But Jack didn't react. His expression remained unchanged, his eyes steady, unswayed by the offer. "I didn't come here for perks," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much to be bought with gestures. "I came here to bury a man who saved my life. And now I'm late." The manager swallowed hard, his face a mask of discomfort, his attempt at damage control crumbling under the weight of Jack's words. "Understood, sir. Please know we're conducting an internal investigation, and Miss Kerr has been suspended pending review." But suspension wouldn't be enough. What was unfolding wasn't just a corporate misstep, it was a reckoning. By 7 o'clock p.m., clips of the incident had flooded every major platform. A 19-second video of Alyssa's confrontation with Jack, her dismissive tone clashing with his quiet dignity, had already begun to spread, igniting a firestorm of reactions. The hashtag was gaining traction, and with it, a growing chorus of voices demanding accountability. For Jack, though, it wasn't about the noise or the outrage. It was about a promise kept, a brother honored, and a system that, for once, might just be forced to remember what it stood for. The video of Alyssa's sly smirk and her cutting remark, "Shiny medals don't mean first class," had exploded across the internet, racking up over 3 million views in mere hours. Her words, dripping with dismissive arrogance, had ignited a firestorm. Hashtags like #medals matter, #honor denied, and #gate42 surged to the top of trending lists, a digital rallying cry that echoed far beyond the confines of a single airport terminal. Veterans groups from coast to coast shared the footage, their captions a blend of heartbreak and outrage, demanding accountability not just for Alyssa, but for a broader system that too often overlooked the quiet sacrifices of service members when no cameras were rolling. Public reactions poured in, a mosaic of emotions. Some comments were tender, reverent. "That man wore the Medal of Honor. You don't need his name to know he deserves respect. Just salute." Others seethed with fury. "This is what happens when we prioritize customer service scripts over basic human decency." Not every voice was kind. A few accused Colonel Jack Whitmore of leveraging his rank, while others argued the airline's response was overblown. Yet for every skeptic, dozens more grasped the deeper truth. This wasn't merely about a policy violation. It was about a fracture in principle, a clash between entitlement and honor. By midnight, the airline caved under the weight of public scrutiny, issuing a carefully worded statement. "We deeply regret the unacceptable treatment of Colonel Jack Whitmore at Gate 42. We have extended a formal apology and are implementing mandatory training for all frontline staff, emphasizing veteran awareness and respect for those who have served." The words were a bandage, but they couldn't soothe the raw sting of what had transpired. Alyssa's fall was swift and unceremonious. Less than an hour after security arrived, she was escorted from the terminal, her belongings hastily packed into a cardboard box. No one protested her departure. No tearful goodbyes marked her exit. Just a long, solitary walk down a corridor lined with strangers, their eyes flickering with recognition as they connected her face to the viral video looping on their phones. Her final defense, "I was just doing my job," rang hollow, drowned out by the damning evidence of the footage, the receipts, and the tidal wave of public condemnation. In that moment, Alyssa felt the weight of her own judgment call, a fleeting decision now mirrored by the unforgiving judgment of millions. Her heart raced, a mix of defiance and dread churning within her. She'd followed protocol, hadn't she? She'd been trained to prioritize policy over sentiment. But as she stepped into the cool night air, the terminal doors sliding shut behind her, a quiet voice in her mind whispered that she'd miscalculated, not just the policy, but the humanity of the man she'd dismissed. For Colonel Jack Whitmore, the ordeal was a wound that cut deeper than the public could see. News crews hounded him for a statement, but he offered none, his silence a shield against the clamor. When an airline representative approached, voice low and apologetic, offering a lifetime of benefits as compensation, Jack's response was measured but unyielding. "The only seat that matters is the one I was trying to take today. I don't need your perks. I need a country that remembers what this medal stands for." His voice carried no anger, only a weary resolve, as if he'd long ago accepted that some battles couldn't be won with words. As he boarded the reinstated flight, a few passengers offered soft words of gratitude, their voices tinged with awe and respect. Jack acknowledged them with a nod, his face unreadable, but inside a storm of emotions churned. He wasn't here for their thanks. He hadn't worn the Medal of Honor to demand special treatment. It was a weight he carried for others, for those who never came home, for those whose sacrifices went unseen. Passing through Gate 42, he said nothing, but his presence spoke volumes. Those who watched him board, his posture straight despite the day's indignity, felt the gravity of the moment. This was a man who could have demanded the world, but asked only for what was right. He hadn't sought to become a symbol, but to the millions watching, he already was. The flight landed at Reagan National Airport just after midnight, the tarmac flanked by unmarked SUVs, a military escort that had shadowed the plane from Denver. No one clapped as the aircraft came to a stop. No fanfare greeted the passengers. Instead, a quiet reverence hung in the air, an acknowledgement of something far greater than a routine flight. The man in seat 2A was no longer just a passenger. He was a living testament to sacrifice, to a silence broken, to honor long overdue. Jack disembarked without a word, his duffel slung over one shoulder, his service cap tucked under his arm. The Medal of Honor, resting against his chest, glinted faintly under the terminal's dim lights, casting a fleeting shimmer across the polished floor. Each step he took was deliberate, heavy with purpose, as he moved through the early morning stillness. Inside, his heart was a battlefield of its own. He felt the weight of the day's events, the sting of Alyssa's words, the fleeting gratitude of strangers. But beneath it all was a deeper ache, a longing for a world where men like him didn't have to fight to be seen. As dawn broke, painting the Potomac River in hues of gold, Jack stood alone at Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery. The air was crisp, the silence sacred. He'd been here before, too many times to honor fallen comrades, brothers in arms, old friends. But this visit was different. This was for David Rios, the man who'd taken 3 bullets in Fallujah to shield Jack's life. David wasn't just a squad leader. He was Jack's anchor, a quiet warrior whose moral clarity held steady when the world around them crumbled. In the chaos of Iraq, David never chased medals or glory. He didn't question orders, he simply ensured the men beside him made it home. Except he hadn't. After Iraq, David fought invisible wars, night terrors that stole his sleep, migraines that gnawed at his sanity, a leg that throbbed with relentless pain. When the VA lost his paperwork for the 3rd time in a year, David had looked at Jack, his eyes hollow but resolute, and said, "I think I'm fighting the wrong war now." Those words haunted Jack, a reminder of promises unkept, of a system that failed the very men it claimed to serve. Standing before David's grave, Jack's chest tightened, grief and gratitude warring within him. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The Medal of Honor around his neck felt heavier than ever, not a badge of pride, but a debt he could never repay. 18 years had passed since that fateful day at the airport gate, but the weight of it still clung to Jack Whitmore like a shadow. Now, standing in his crisp dress blues, his shoulders squared and eyes fixed on the horizon, he watched as the honor guard moved with mechanical precision. Their rifles snapped in unison, the sharp crack echoing across the rolling hills of the cemetery. A lone bugler raised his instrument, and the haunting notes of taps drifted on the breeze, each note a quiet reminder of finality. Beneath the soil lay David, a man who had served his country with unwavering courage, now resting in a flag-draped casket, honored with the full military rights he deserved. Yet for those left behind, the ceremony was both a tribute and a wound reopened. Elena, David's widow, stood among the mourners, her face etched with grief but held together by a strength forged through years of sacrifice. Her eyes, red-rimmed from tears, carried a quiet resolve as she approached Jack after the service. In her hands, she held a tightly folded American flag, its stars and stripes a symbol of a life given in service. "General Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "David always said you were the reason he lived as long as he did. He never forgot what you did for him." Her words landed like a stone in Jack's chest, stirring memories of a moment he had never allowed himself to fully reconcile. Jack took the flag, his hands trembling, not from age or frailty, but from the flood of memories that refused to dull with time. The weight of the fabric felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just the honor of a fallen soldier, but the burden of promises kept and debts unpaid. "I didn't save him," Jack said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. "He saved me. He gave me 20 more years of life. Fighting for a seat on that plane was the least I could do." His words were raw, laced with a guilt that had gnawed at him for years. He had fought for David's chance to come home, but in the end, no one could fight the war that had claimed him. Elena nodded, her eyes softening with an understanding that transcended words. She knew the bond between the two men, the kind of brotherhood forged in the crucible of service. Behind her stood David's 3 children, their dark coats stark against the green of the cemetery. The eldest, a young woman in her father's image, watched Jack with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The middle child, a teenage boy, stood with his hands clasped as if trying to hold himself together. But it was the youngest, a girl no older than 10, who stepped forward. Her small frame trembled as she raised her hand in a salute, her eyes wide and searching. Jack returned the gesture, his throat tightening as his vision blurred with unshed tears. In that moment, he saw David in her face, and the weight of his loss pressed harder against his heart. As the crowd dispersed, the mourners drifting away to their cars, Jack lingered. The groundsmen moved quietly, tending to the grave with a reverence that spoke of their own understanding of loss. Jack knelt beside the fresh earth, removing his cap and resting it on his knee. The cool soil beneath his fingers grounded him as he whispered, "I kept my promise, brother. I made it." The wind stirred the leaves overhead, a soft rustle that felt like a reploin. For a moment, he was back at that airport gate, facing down indifference with a fire he hadn't known he possessed. But today the fight was over, and all that remained was the quiet of a promise fulfilled. As Jack rose and walked away from the grave, his thoughts drifted beyond the personal to something broader, something that had simmered in his mind for years. The confrontation at Gate 42 hadn't just been about David or a single moment of injustice. It was a symptom of a deeper truth, the quiet dismissal of those who had served. How many veterans, he wondered, had tucked their medals into drawers, their sacrifices reduced to faded ribbons? How many widows had been told their paperwork was incomplete, their grief compounded by bureaucracy? These were men and women who had answered their country's call, only to return to a nation that too often met them with indifference dressed as policy. Jack didn't want to be a symbol or a figurehead for protest, but as he reached the cemetery's perimeter fence, where the hum of distant traffic broke the silence, he couldn't shake the hope that what happened that day might spark something real, something that could outlast the headlines. A reporter stood nearby, notepad in hand, his presence respectful but expectant. Jack had no intention of making a statement, but something compelled him to turn. "Make sure they understand," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "Marvis isn't about privilege. It's about sacrifice. And that doesn't end when the war does." He held the reporter's gaze for a moment before turning back to the black sedan waiting for him. It wasn't a limousine or a convoy, just a simple car sent by an old friend at the Pentagon, a gesture of gratitude that didn't need fanfare. As the car pulled away, Jack's eyes lingered on the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance. Each one bore a name, a story, a life given in service. For one day, perhaps for longer, the nation had paused to remember what those names meant. Yet even as the cemetery faded from view, a question lingered in Jack's mind, as persistent as the bugle's final note. Why did veterans, especially those who had earned their nation's highest honors, still face such treatment? The moment at Gate 42 hadn't been an isolated incident. It was a mirror reflecting a broader truth, the growing divide between those who served and those who hadn't. Most Americans had never worn a uniform. Fewer than 7% of the population were veterans, and of those, even fewer carried visible signs of their service. They didn't speak of their sacrifices, didn't expect recognition, and certainly didn't demand it. That humility, while noble, often became the reason they were overlooked, forgotten, or dismissed, as if their contributions came with an expiration date. The gate agent's words, "Medals don't buy first class," had cut deeper than cruelty. They were a symptom of a bureaucratic indifference that veterans navigated daily, not just in airports, but in VA hospitals, housing offices, job interviews, and even classrooms. "Thank you for your service" had become a hollow phrase in too many places, a polite reflex that masked a lack of understanding. As the sedan carried Jack away, he couldn't help but wonder how many others had stood where he had, fighting not just for themselves, but for the dignity of those who had given everything. And yet, in the quiet of that moment, he held on to a flicker of hope, that one day the nation might truly honor not just the fallen, but the living who carried their legacy forward. Gratitude, when spoken without follow-through, rings hollow. Words of thanks, no matter how well-intentioned, lose their weight when they're not backed by action. For veterans, this isn't just a fleeting disappointment. It's a deep, aching wound that compounds the emotional toll of their service. Imagine being thanked by a system that then leaves you stranded, waiting 6 hours on a phone line to refill a prescription for PTSD medication, or forces you to endure an 18-month delay for disability benefits, or sends you shuffling between 3 different offices just to arrange a funeral for a brother-in-arms who never made it home. Each delay, each dismissed request, feels like a betrayal, not from malice, but from indifference. Veterans are conditioned to endure, forged in the crucible of war to withstand hardship. But they shouldn't have to battle apathy on their own soil, where their sacrifices are supposed to mean something. There's a chasm between the world veterans inhabit and the civilian life that surrounds them. It's not born of hostility, but of detachment, a quiet, unintentional divide. For many civilians, military service is an abstract concept, something glimpsed in movies or briefly acknowledged during a holiday. Sacrifice is theoretical, a word tossed around without the visceral understanding of what it costs. Memorial Day, for too many, is a long weekend, a chance for barbecues or sales, not a solemn moment to mourn the fallen. Veterans like Colonel Jack Whitmore, who carry visible symbols of their service, like the Medal of Honor pinned to their chest, step into public spaces and often find themselves met with misunderstanding. Some view them with suspicion, as if their quiet pride is a bid for attention. Others feel a flicker of envy, unable to grasp the price paid for that recognition, and some simply don't know enough to care. It's easier for people to assume a veteran is seeking special treatment than to acknowledge they have already earned it through blood, sweat, and loss. The result is a relentless cycle. Veterans must prove their worth again and again, long after their uniform should have spoken for them. Each time they're forced to justify their existence, it chips away at the dignity they fought so hard to preserve. Yet, amidst the indifference, there are glimmers of genuine honor. Programs like Honor Flights offer aging veterans the chance to visit Washington, D.C., to stand before the memorials built for their brothers and sisters, often for the first time in their lives. For these men and women, many in their twilight years, the experience is a flood of emotions, pride, grief, and a quiet validation that their service mattered. In small towns, young children wave flags at parades, their innocent salutes carrying a purity that touches even the most hardened hearts. Strangers in diners sometimes pick up a veteran's tab, offering a nod of quiet gratitude that speaks louder than words. These moments, though fleeting, are powerful. They remind veterans they're not entirely forgotten. But gestures alone, no matter how heartfelt, can't replace systemic respect. A free flight or a reserved parking spot doesn't erase the frustration of being unheard when a veteran says, "I need help." It doesn't heal the invisible wounds, PTSD, moral injury, or the quiet guilt of surviving when others didn't, that are too often dismissed or misunderstood. True respect means listening, believing, and acting. It means standing with veterans not just on the battlefield, but when they're navigating the labyrinth of bureaucracy back home. Colonel Jack Whitmore didn't ask for a pedestal. He didn't want fanfare or special privileges. All he sought was dignity, the simple right to honor a fallen friend without being diminished. When that right was denied, when he was turned away at an airport gate, the sting wasn't just personal. It was a reflection of a broader truth. Too often, veterans are seen as relics, not as living, breathing men and women who still carry the weight of their service. Jack's response wasn't anger or outrage, though he would have been justified in feeling both. Instead, he chose resolve. He stood tall, his silence louder than any shout could have been. In that moment, he embodied a truth about honor. It doesn't need to be loud to be profound. It doesn't demand attention, but when it's ignored, it exposes the cracks in the systems we've built. Jack's quiet strength became a symbol, not just of his own sacrifice, but of every veteran who's been asked to prove their worth one time too many. The image of Jack at that gate, calm, steady, humiliated but unbroken, lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation that captured attention. It was the stark contrast. Here was a man who had bled for his country, who wore a medal that told a story of unimaginable courage, being refused a seat by someone who didn't even know his name. And then, in a moment that felt like the world holding its breath, the airport seemed to pause. Someone recognized him. Someone remembered who he was, what he stood for. The ripple of that recognition spread, not because Jack demanded it, but because his quiet dignity made it impossible to ignore. In his restraint, he became more than a man. He became a reminder of what we owe those who serve. But this story isn't just about Jack. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make in the small, fleeting moments that reveal who we are. If you were at that gate watching a man in uniform be told his medals didn't matter, would you have spoken up? Would you have stepped forward, voice steady to say, "This isn't right"? Or would you have looked away, eyes fixed on your phone, letting the moment pass? These moments, as minor as they seem, are mirrors. They reflect how we value those who've given the most. And if we're honest, we too often let them slip by, choosing comfort over courage. We tell ourselves it's not our place, that someone else will step in, that it's just one small slight in a world full of them. But for veterans, those slights accumulate, each one a reminder that their service is seen as a footnote, not a foundation. Veterans aren't props to be trotted out for parades or holiday speeches. They're not just stories to be dusted off once a year. They are the men and women who carried this nation when it faltered, who stood in the breach when others couldn't. In return, they deserve more than automated apologies or vague promises of reform. They deserve to be seen not as heroes on a pedestal, but as people with needs, with wounds, with stories that demand to be heard. They deserve to be remembered, not just in memorials of stone, but in the way we treat them while they're still here, still standing, still fighting battles we can't see. Jack Whitmore never raised his voice. He didn't argue or demand. Yet in his silence, he spoke volumes. His restraint, his dignity, became a beacon, illuminating the quiet strength of those who serve. The image of him at that gate, unwavering despite the indignity, wasn't just a moment. It was a call to action. It was a challenge to do better, to be better. Because the next time someone like Jack is told to step aside, it's not just his honor at stake. It's ours.